The beaver is a vicious animal. Well, no, it isn't. It kind of just likes to make dams and chew on trees. But beavers are inspirational. They inspire our sports teams and new ways to engineer, and it should inspire you to subscribe to this channel, where we upload great frontier videos every week. Come explore the American frontier with us and leave a comment down below and help us learn all about American history. So hit that subscribe button and never miss any videos from exploring the American frontier. And don't forget to like it. Now let's dig deep into these beavers. Hello there. Did you ever wonder if a beaver would make a great hat? Why, yes, they do. In fact, the early trappers and traders, who came to be known in the West as mountain men, were the pioneer explorers of Utah. And their coming west was not prompted by patriotism, but by economic motives. It was the beaver skins that lured them. High-topped beaver hats worn in the big cities rustled the demand and made the market explode with beaver fever. So into the wilderness went brigades of hardy men, braving winter storms, grizzlies, and hostile Indians. For months they lived on an all-meat diet. In good times, it was buffalo hump ribs and venison. In hard times, scrawny mule steaks, Indian dog meat, or stewed moccasins. Once wedded in the wilds and having had the thin veneer of civilization rubbed off, the typical fur gatherer was loath to return to the restrictions of town life. Opening fresh trails and discovering new lands were to but part of the day's work, incidental to the business of trapping. Virgin territory was likely to yield the greatest return in pelts, so there was money reward for trailblazing. Most of the trappers were young men, strong, hardy, adventure-loving. With their bronzed faces and long hair, it was difficult to distinguish one from another, or all from a band of Indians. In a beaver or coonskin cap, and a fringed buckskin suit, flamboyantly decorated with dyed porcupine quills or break-glass beads, the trapper was proudly dressed. With a powder horn, shot pouch, and muzzle-loading rifle, he was self-supporting and independent. In his day, beaver skins were money in the West. And with these hairy banknotes, he could buy anything that was for sale. At the summer rendezvous, that great fair of the wilderness, trappers, Indians, and bougie traders gathered in some mountain valley to exchange fur for supplies. Amidst the horse races and foot races, the wrestling bouts, Indian dances, shooting matches, fights, the gambling and drinking, the seasoned fur trapper had his brief holiday of prodigal living. Most fur men were without book learning, but they were educated for the life they led. They could read the tracks of moccasins, the sign of beaver, the trace of travois. They could mold their bullets from bars of lead and strike a fire with flint and steel. A skin lodge furnished the trapper with shelter, while, for summer nights, a buffalo robe was spread beneath the stars. A horse to ride, one to carry his trappings, others for his squaw and children. If he had been long in the wilderness, he could journey wherever the trails led, or did not lead. He gloried in the name of mountain man. The Utah region, like other areas in the West, was first thoroughly explored by the fur men. One of the earliest and most important industries in North America, the American fur trade, played a major role in the development of the United States and Canada for more than 300 years. A commercial fur trade in North America grew out of early contact between Indians and European fishermen who were netting cod on the Grand Banks off Newfoundland and on the Bay of Gaspé near Quebec. Indians would trade the pelts of small animals, such as mink, for knives and other iron-based products, or for textiles. Exchange at first was haphazard, and it was only in the late 16th century that the wearing of beaver hats became fashionable. that firms were established who dealt exclusively in furs. High-quality pelts are available only where winters are severe, so the trade took place predominantly in the regions we now know as Canada. Although some activity took place further south along the Mississippi River and the Rocky Mountains. There was also a market in deer skins that predominated in the Appalachians. The first firms to participate in the fur trade were French, and under French rule, the trade spread along the St. Lawrence and Ottawa rivers and down the Mississippi. In the 17th century, following the Dutch, the English developed the trade through Albany. Then in 1670, a charter was granted by the British Crown to the Hudson Bay Company, which began operating from posts along the coast of Hudson Bay. For roughly the next 100 years, this northern region saw competition of varying intensity between the French and the English. With the conquest of New France in 1763, the French trade shifted to Scottish merchants operating out of Montreal. After the negotiation of Jay's Treaty, the northern border was defined and trade along the Mississippi passed to the American Fur Company under John Jacob Astor. In 1821, the northern participants merged under the name of the Hudson Bay Company, and for many decades, this merged company continued to trade in furs. Finally, in the 1990s, under pressure from animal rights groups, the Hudson Bay Company, which in the 20th century had become a large Canadian retailer, ended the fur component of its operation. The demand for fur. Hats, pelts, and prices. The fur trade was based on pelts destined either for the luxury clothing market or for the felting industries, of which hatting was most important. This was a transatlantic trade. The animals were trapped in exchange for goods in Northern America, and the pelts were transported to Europe for processing and final sale. As a result, forces operating on the demand side of the market in Europe and on the supply side in Northern America determined prices and volumes, while intermediaries, who linked the two geographically separated areas, determined how the trade was conducted. However much hats may be considered an accessory today, they were for centuries a mandatory part of everyday dress for both men and women. Of course, styles change. In response to the vagaries of fashion and politics, hats took on various forms and shapes, from the high-crowned, broad-brimmed hat of the first two Stuarts to the conically shaped, plainer hat of the Puritans. The restoration of George II of England in 1660 and the Glorious Revolution of 1689 brought their own changes in style. What remains a constant was the material from which the hats were made, wool felt. The wool came from various animals, but towards the end of the 15th century, beaver wool became to be predominant. Over time, beaver hats became increasingly popular, eventually dominating the market. Only in the 19th century did silk replace beaver in high-fashion men's hats. Wool felt. Furs have long been classified as either fancy or staple. Fancy furs are those demanded for the beauty and luster of their pelt. These furs, minx, fox, and otter, are shaped by furs into garments or robes. Staple furs are sought for their wool. All staple furs have a double coating of hair with long, stiff, smooth hairs called guard hairs, which protect the shorter, softer hair called wool that grows next to the animal skin. Only the wool can be felted. Each of the shorter hairs is barbed, and once the barb at the end of the hair are open, the wool can be compressed into a solid piece of material called felt. The prime staple fur has been beaver, although muskrat and rabbit have been used. Wool felt was used for over 2 centuries in making high fashion hats. Felt is stronger than woven material It will not tear or unravel in a straight line. It is more resistant to water, and it will hold its shape even if it's wet. These characteristics made felt a prime material for hatters, especially when fashion called for hats with large brims. The highest quality hats would be made fully of beaver wool, whereas lower quality hats included inferior wool, such as rabbits. The transformation of beaver skins into felt and then hats was a highly skilled activity. The process required first that the beaver wool be separated from the guard hairs and the skin, and that some of the wool have open barbs, since felt required some open barb wool in the mixture. Felt dates back to the nomads of Central Asia, who are said to have invented the process of felting, and made their tents from the light but durable material. The opening of the North American trade not only increased the supply of skins for the felt industry, it also provided a subset of skins whose guard hairs had already been removed and the keratin broken down. Beaver pelts imported from North America were classified as either parchment beaver, dry beaver, or coat beaver, greasy beaver. Parchment beaver were from freshly caught animals whose skins were simply dried before being presented for trade. Coat beaver were skins that had been worn by Indians for a year or more. With wear, the guard hairs fell out and the pelt became oily and more pliable. In addition, the keratin covering the shorter hairs broke down. By the middle of the 17th century, hatters and felt makers came to learn that parchment and coat beaver could be combined to produce a strong, smooth, pliable, top-quality, waterproof material. Until the 1720s, beaver felt was produced with relatively fixed proportions of coat and parchment skin, which led to periodic shortages of one or the other type of pelt. The constraint was relaxed when keratin was developed, a chemical process by which parchment skins were transformed into a type of coat beaver. The original keratin formula consisted of salts of mercury diluted in nitric acid, which was brushed on the pelts. The use of mercury was a big advantage, but it also had serious health consequences for hatters and felters, who were forced to breathe the mercury vapor for extended periods. The expression, "mad as a hatter," dates from this period, as the vapor attacked the nervous systems of these workers. The supply of furs, the harvesting of beaver and depletion. The prices of parchment and coat beaver. Drawn from the accounts of the Hudson Bay Company, Table 1 presents some 18th century prices of parchment and coat beaver pelts. From 1713 to 1726, before the keratin process had become established, coat beaver generally fetched a higher price than parchment beaver, averaging 6 shillings per pelt as compared to 5.5 shillings. Once keratin was widely used, however, the prices were reversed, and from 1730 to 1770, parchment exceeded coat in almost every way. Once keratin was widely used, however, the prices were reversed, and from 1730 to 1770, parchment exceeded coat in almost every year. What's up, YouTube? I wanted to take a second and ask everyone to subscribe to my channel. If you enjoy this content, please smash that like button, share with your friends, and subscribe. About 85% of people who watch this content do not subscribe. Help everyone find Exploring the American Frontier by subscribing, liking, and sharing. Thank you. And we're back. During the 18th century, the changing technology of felt production and the growing demand of felt hats were met by the attempts to increase the supply of furs, especially the supply of beaver pelts. Any permanent increase, however, was ultimately dependent upon the animal resource base. How that base changed over time must be a matter of speculation, since no animal counts exist from that period. Nevertheless, the evidence we do have points to a scenario in which overharvesting, at least in some years, have rise to serious depletion of beaver and possibly other animals such as marten that were also being traded. Why the beaver were over-harvested was closely related to the prices natives were receiving, but important as well was the nature of native property rights to the resource. That beaver populations along the eastern seaboard regions of North America were depleted as the fur trade advanced is widely accepted. In fact, the search for new sources of supply further west, including the region of Hudson Bay, has been attributed in part to dwindling beaver stocks in areas where the fur trade had been long established. Indians were the primary agents in the North American commercial fur trade. It was they who hunted the animals and transported and traded the pelts, or skins, to European intermediaries. The exchange was voluntary. In return for their furs, Indians obtained both access to iron technology to improve production and gain access to a wide range of new consumer goods. It is important to recognize, however, that although the European goods were new to the Aboriginals, the concept of exchange was not. The archaeological evidence indicates an extensive trade between native tribes in the north and south of North America prior to European contact. The extraordinary records of the Hudson Bay Company allow us to form a clear picture of what Indians were buying. Table 2 lists the goods received by the Indians at the New York factory, which was by far the largest of Hudson Bay's company trading posts. As it is evident from the table, the commercial trade was more than beads and baubles, or even guns and alcohol. Rather, native traders were receiving a wide range of products that improved their ability to meet their subsistence requirements and allowed them to raise their living standards. The items have been grouped by use. The producer good category was dominated by firearms, including guns, shot and powder, but also including knives, awls, and twine. The natives traded for guns of different lengths. The 3-foot gun was used mainly for waterfowl and in heavily forested areas where game could be shot at close range. A 4-foot gun was more accurate and suitable for open spaces. In addition, the 4-foot gun could play a role in warfare. Maintaining guns in the harsh subarctic environment was a serious problem, and ultimately the Hudson Bay Company was forced to send gunsmiths to its trading post to assess quality and help with repairs. Kettles and blankets were the main items in the household goods category. These goods probably became necessary to the natives who adopted them. Then there were the luxury goods, which have been divided into 2 broad categories: tobacco and alcohol, and other luxuries, dominated by cloth of various kinds. The records of the Hudson Bay Company provide us with a unique window to the trading process, including the bargaining ability of native traders, which is evident in the range of commodities received. Natives only bought the goods they wanted. Clear from the company records is that it was the natives who largely determined the nature and the quality of those goods. As well, the records tell us how income from the trade was being allocated. The trade breakdown differed by post and varied over time, but, for example, in 1740, at the York factory, the distribution was producer goods 44%, household goods 9%, tobacco and alcohol 24%, and other luxuries 23%. An important implication of the trade data is that, like many Europeans and most American colonists, Native Americans were taking part in consumer revolution of the 18th century. In addition to necessities, they were consuming a remarkable variety of luxury products. Cloth, including baize, duffel, flannel, and gartering, was by far the largest class, but they also purchased beads, combs, looking glasses, rings, shirts, and vermilion, among a much larger list. Because these items were heterogeneous in nature, the Hudson Bay Company head office went to great lengths to satisfy the specific taste of native customers. Attempts were also made, not always successfully, to introduce new products. Perhaps surprising, given the emphasis has been placed on that historical literature, was comparatively small role of alcohol in the trade. At York Factory, native traders received the 1740 a total of 494 gallons of brandy and strong water, which had a value of 1,976 made beaver. More than twice this amount was spent on tobacco in that year. Nearly 5 times was spent on firearms, twice was spent on clothes, and more was spent on blankets and kettles than alcohol. Thus, brandy, although a significant item of trade, was by no means the dominant one. In addition, alcohol could hardly have created a serious social problem during this period. The amount received would have allotted no more than 10 2-ounce drinks per year for an adult native population living in the region. The labor supply of natives. Another important question can be addressed using the trade data. Were natives lazy and impoverent, as they have been described by some contemporaries, or were they industrious like American colonists and many Europeans? Central to answering this question is how native groups responded to the price of furs, which began rising in the 1730s. Much of the literature argues that Indian trappers reduced their effort in response to higher fur prices, that is, they had backward-bending supply curves of labor. The view is that natives had a fixed demand for European goods that, at higher fur prices, they could be met at fewer furs and hence less effort. Although widely cited, this argument does not stand up. Not only were higher fur prices accompanied by larger total harvests of furs in the region, but pattern native expenditure also points to a scenario of great effort. From the late 1730s to the 1760s, as the price of furs rose, the share of expenditure on luxury goods increased dramatically. Thus, natives were not content simply to accept their good fortune by working less. Rather, they seized the opportunity provided to them by a strong fur market by increasing their effort in the commercial sector, thereby dramatically augmenting the purchases of those goods, namely the luxuries that could raise their living standard. A note on the non-commercial sector. As important as the fur trade was to Native Americans in the subarctic region of Canada, commerce in the European Compromise is just one relatively small part of the overall economy. Exact figures are unavailable, but the traditional sectors, hunting, gathering, food preparation, and to some extent agricultural, must have accounted for at least 75 to 85% of native labor during these decades. Nevertheless, despite the limited time spent in commercial activity, the fur trade had a profound effect on the nature of the native economy and native society. The introduction of European producer goods, such as guns and household goods, mainly kettles and blankets, changed the way Native Americans achieved subsistence, and the European luxury goods expanded the range of products that allowed them to move beyond subsistence. Most importantly, the fur trade connected natives to Europeans in ways that affected how much they chose to work, where they chose to live, and how they exploited the resources on which the trade and their survival was based. At first, the Europeans and Americans involved in the trade did not intend to hunt and trap the beaver and other fur-bearing animals themselves. Rather, they hoped the Indians in the region would supply the furs in exchange for guns, knives, and traps. By the early 1800s, however, they realized that the Indians could not or would not produce enough furs to satisfy the demand for fur in Europe and America. The companies involved in the trade began in the 1820s to employ their own hunters and trappers. These hunters and trappers lived year-round in the mountains, close to their work. The life was hard and it was dangerous. The following screen is a picture of Fort Laramie. It was a large trading post in what is now Wyoming. At first, the fur trading companies tried to have Indians supply them with furs. The companies established a series of forts or trading posts like this one, where Indians could exchange their furs for manufactured items. The companies even established smaller trading posts that moved around to be more convenient for the Indians. The companies soon gave up on this idea. The trading post proved to be expensive to maintain, and the Indians produced too furs to satisfy the demand for them. In 1825, William Ashley struck upon the idea of a yearly rendezvous to exchange goods for the furs. For the next 20 years or so, the rendezvous largely replaced the trading post as centers for these exchanges. Even so, several forts such as Fort Laramie survived. They continued to provide many services and goods for many trappers. By the 1840s, Fort Laramie was a major stop for emigrants along the Oregon Trail. By this time, many farmer trappers served as scout and wagon masters for the emigrant trains traveling the Oregon and California. This is a drawing of a fur trapper of the early 1800s. The artist Frederick Remington drew this picture years after these mountain men had passed the scene. Remington imagined the trappers had been rugged individuals who faced hardships and dangers all alone. Trappers did not live close to nature. They hunted wild game for food and wore clothing made of animal skins. Some trappers did work alone. However, most worked for fur companies that sent trappers into small groups. Few had to face the dangers of the wilderness by themselves. The vast majority of mountain men worked directly for the large fur company. The vast majority of mountain men worked directly for a large fur trading company. These companies employed hundreds of trappers and hunters at a time. These hunters and trappers worked for wages. The companies supplied the hired trappers with their food, equipment, and other supplies. The furs produced by these hunters belonged to the company. William H. Ashley was quoted in the Missouri Gazette and Advertiser in 1822 saying, "To enterprise young men, the subscriber wishes to engage 100 men to ascend travel upon steam down the river Missouri to its source, there to be employed for 1, 2, or 3 years. For particularly inquire of Major Andrew Henry, near the lead mines in the county of Washington, who will ascend with and command the party, or to the subscriber at St. Louis." Trappers depended on themselves to supply their own food and water. They lived mostly on meat and animals they killed. In larger camps, the most skilled hunters did most of the hunting. In small camps, the trappers often took turns hunting for game. When hunting was good and meat was plentiful, the trappers gorged themselves on the best parts of buffalo and other game. The tongue, liver, and the hump ribs of buffalo were the choice parts. When game was less plentiful, the trappers ate even the toughest parts. When food was scarce, as trappers said, meat was meat. By this is what they meant, that in hard times they would eat just about anything. This included beaver, rabbits, and other small animals. In really hard times, the trappers ate their own pack animals, and in other cases, even their own moccasins. Starving trappers even ate insects. Trapper Joe Meek, for example, was so hungry that once he held his hands over an ant hill. When his hands were covering the ants, he licked them clean. The trappers began work early and ended it late. Even so, the trapper's life depended upon the time of year. Trappers' work was seasonal. They usually went on 2 hunts every year, one in the fall and one in the spring. At these times, the trappers fanned out searching for beaver. The camps were the busiest at these times. The trappers hunted and brought back pelts. The camping keepers in turn scraped, stretched, and otherwise prepared the pelts for packing. At the same time, hunters supplied meat for the busy and hungry workers. In the summer, the trappers were less busy. They moved about, hunting game and fish, and otherwise relaxed more than during the hunting seasons. Summertime was also the season for the trappers' annual rendezvous. In the winter, the trappers stayed close to their camps. They built solid shelters to keep warm and dry. They did not hunt for furs in the winter, but they did have to hunt for food, wood, and water. This kind of work was even more difficult to accomplish in winter. Mountain men lived most of the year cut off from all contact of the east. Except for short periods at the summer rendezvous, they lived a primitive way of life. They had to adapt to the environment in which they found themselves. They faced dangers of all sorts and had to rely on one another to avoid or deal with these dangers. Most mountain men became used to the hardships, as few of them returned to civilized society. Most chose to stay in the West. The fur trade was a global business. That is, most of the furs trappers in the Rocky Mountains produced found their way into the international market. European demand for furs gave the furs their value. It was the primary reason why trapping was a lucrative job for mountain men. When the European demand for fur declined in the 1840s, the value of furs declined and the fur trade collapsed. Trappers faced many hardship and dangers. They had to provide for their own food, clothing, and shelter. When they or their animals were injured, they had to treat their injury. They had to repair broken traps and rifles. The dangers they faced included attacks by hostile Indians and encounters with ferocious grizzly bears. I imagine the trappers to be rugged individuals who faced hardships and dangers all alone. Trappers did live close to nature. They hunted wild game for food and wore clothing made of animal skins. Some trappers did work alone, however, most worked for fur companies that sent trappers out in small groups. Few had to face the dangers of the wilderness by themselves. The store-bought clothes that trappers had worn when they traveled to the mountains soon worn out. They replaced these with clothing similar to that worn by the Indians in the area. They wore outer garments made of buckskin, with seams fringed with lace. They used the fringes as string or thread to repair clothing, moccasins, and equipment. The trappers wore undershirts made of flannel or cotton. When those wore out, they made shirts of antelope. The trappers quickly wore out of their shoes or boots. They replaced them with Indian-style moccasins, usually made of buffalo hide. They made stockings from parts of blankets they brought with them. They used buffalo skin to make the lower part of trouser legs, as buckskin usually lost its shape or shrank in the water where trappers spent most of their time during the trapping season. Buffalo robes serve as blankets and heavy coats during the cold winter temperatures. Trappers also wore fur hats with ear flaps during the wintertime. One of the chief entertainments of the mountain men was yarn spinning or telling stories around the campfire. The talk around the evening campfire was a way for trappers to amuse themselves. It was a way to pass the important lessons of the trapper's life. Perhaps this was because most mountain men were young and uneducated. Many were illiterate. Unfortunately, they did not write down or preserve any of these stories. Living the life of an outdoor frontiersman was an adventure. Every day you had another hardship, test, and journey, and for the fur trappers and guides who wandered the mountains, plains, and crossed the streams and rivers to seize the day and explore the American frontier. Thank you for joining me, and please be sure to share, like, and subscribe for more frontier videos like this one.